Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek UK. I'm Danny Rogers, Editor-in-Chief for PRWeek EMEA, and your host for today. And in a rare appearance on these shores is an old friend and colleague, Steve Barrett, the Editorial Director for both PRWeek and campaign titles in the good old US of A. How are you doing, Steve?
Doing very well, Danny. Great to see you.
You're very welcome. So because Steve is over in London this week to host PRWeek's Global Awards, which take place in London tomorrow evening, tickets still available, I'm told. I thought it would be a good chance for two supposed comms industry leaders and experts on both sides of the pond to have a good chat. And of course, it's an opportune time to do so. PRWeek UK has just published our Top 150 UK PR Consultancies report. And PRWeek US has simultaneously published its Global Agency Business Report, a very similar report in your market, Steve. These reports, of course, give the very best picture that exists of the health of and the trends in the global comms sector. So, as UK listeners know, our UK Top 150 figures this year show that 2023 was a pretty tough year in PR consultancy. Yes, the overall revenue of the 150 biggest agencies did grow by about 6.5% per annum, but this was about half the growth enjoyed in previous years. And bearing in mind UK inflation has been averaging more than 6% over the past 12 months, real revenue growth was virtually non-existent for a change. All of which suggests that margins have been very much squeezed for both clients and PR agencies. So Steve, is that a similar picture in the US and globally? Any better or worse than those figures?
Well, first of all, Danny, thanks for inviting me on. It's a great honour to be on the show, my first appearance. And let's promise not to talk about our respective soccer teams, shall we, over the next 40 minutes, because they're both absolute bobbins. But yeah, it's an interesting picture you paint there of the UK market, and it's definitely reflected in the US and globally. If you look at overall growth in the US, it was 3%, and that was the same globally as well. And if you think inflation in the States was 3.4%, so similar story. You compare that to the prior year, it was 15% growth, and then the prior year before that, it was 19%. So we had two fantastic years as an industry, I think, and that's not going to carry on forever, right? That was post-COVID. Everyone was getting back into it. I think people understood better the value of comms and what it could bring. And actually flat in a year like last year, a lot of people we spoke to were saying, that's okay, right? There were some firms who got some good growth. Shandwick did very well, goal in. Edelman had a bad year. I think that was well documented because they'd already put their numbers out. So they were down 9% in the States.
Yeah, down in the States.
Yeah.
Over here it was about 4% growth.
Right.
Globally it was slightly down overall. Edelman.
Overall they were down 3% globally. So they kind of mirrored the average drop globally. But in the US, which is their biggest market, they were down 9.1%. That's a big drop.
Edelman is very much the iconic PR agency, being the biggest global independent. And I seem to remember Richard Edelman said a lot of that was down to tech clients just not spending enough last year.
Yeah, it was a few things. Yeah, they are iconic. They were the first one to cross $1 billion revenue, and they stayed above that despite going down 9.1%. So they are a bellwether for the industry. They lost some AOR assignments. The biggest tech pitch of the year was AMD. And they lost that to BCW. That was a subsidiary Axicom, a tech specialist. They lost a tech brief to We Communications for PwC and corporate AOR status for HP. They lost that to Shandwick, and they also lost a piece of corporate work for Molson's Coors to Brunswick. So yeah, they've lost some business, and we know some other accounts actually that they're either repitching or potentially going to be losing. So they lost a lot of talent as well to BCW and Weber particularly. And Richard put that down to moving from a geography to a practice-based structure and said some leavers were unhappy about that, with the geographies becoming less important. And they made high-profile job cuts in June 2023 and December 2022.
And what about their big rival Weber? Because they seem to have had a slightly better year than Edelman.
Yeah, they did. In fact, the IPG firms generally, and you can see this actually reflected in the holding company numbers. We've seen the Q1s come through, and we saw the full years. And IPG had a pretty good year. So in Q1, Golin, which was our agency of the year at the PRWeek US Awards, they were up almost double digits in Q1.
So what do we feel that IPG agencies are doing that Edelman wasn't over the past year?
I think Edelman had a bad year. And, Richard Edelman talked about a culture and losing some people there. But you know what Richard's like. He's a fighter and he brings it every year, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And you can be sure he'll be putting together the plan to bounce back. And, I think 2024 is looking, especially after Q1, I think it's looking a little bit more
so we could
positive.
See better figures this year.
Do you remember that Sir Martin Sorrell used to talk about the maxi quadrennial effect?
Oh, yeah, with the
Olympics, elections, and the European Soccer Championships. Sorry, I'm saying soccer. I'm in the UK. Football. I don't think that has the same impact anymore. I think we can talk in a bit more detail about specific areas that are growing. But the general, all boats rise is not quite as true as it used to be for those things.
Yeah. In fact, I was going to ask you because we certainly saw corporate, financial and political agencies outperforming the big generalists and the consumer agencies. So, for example, in the UK, Brunswick didn't have a great year. They're still the biggest agency in the UK. But agencies such as FTI, Teneo, Headland, APCO all achieved double-digit growth last year, unlike most agencies. Some of that expansion was acquisitive rather than necessarily organic growth. But even so, corporate and political consultancy does seem to be doing better than general brand consultancy. Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. And I would add FGS to that list, which is the roll-up, the WPP roll-up of Finsbury, Glover Park and Herring-Schupner. They had a very good year, and all of the firms that kind of specialise in that area, people want senior counsel, they want corporate affairs advice. We've even seen on the client side a lot of them restructuring their teams to have the corporate affairs person leading. So the CCO is maybe a little less important or even not in the structure, but the head of corporate affairs is the de facto head of comms. So you put that down to, look at the geopolitical situation. There's strife all around the world.
And elections all around the world.
And there's 50, 60 elections this year. Yeah. So DC's buzzing. We had a crisis conference in DC a few weeks ago. It was a sellout. We were literally turning people away, which is not always the case for conferences. So, that sort of high level works. A lot of organizations are transforming themselves, businesses and brands, and they continue to do so, and they need help doing that. I should say a little bit about maybe the trends that caused the drop in growth. I think you talked about conservative clients, slightly more conservative, so they were sitting on their hands a bit, sitting on budgets, taking a much longer time to make decisions, maybe doing a project rather than an AOR thing, or doing part one of a project and not signing off on part two until much later. So we talked to the PR Council lead, which is the trade body for PR agencies, Kim Sample, and she said her members have definitely been seeing longer times to get the deals struck. So you win the pitch, used to take 3 or 4 weeks to get through procurement and get the contract signed and start working. Now that's taking 2 to 3 months.
Yeah.
Procurement's much more involved.
It's exactly the same picture over here. Presumably that's just because clients are more cautious about their budgets at a time of high inflation and cost crisis for consumers, that they're just spending less and being more cautious.
Yeah, I think it's harder to read the overall economy. There are some positive signs in the US about especially job numbers. There was better news on inflation last year, but that's turning again, and that's starting to go back in the wrong direction again as we move toward the election. And clients are sitting and watching, and they've turned the purpose tap off a little bit. So it's difficult for agencies to plan. If you win a big contract, you've got to wait 2 or 3 months. You might have to be hiring people. You want to be planning who's going to work on this stuff. How are you going to deploy your teams? It's much more difficult for them to do so. So, yeah, that's had a knock-on effect right through the industry.
So, in summary, then, does 2024 look better than 2023 in US PR consultancy?
Yeah, I think so. I think there will be a bump with the election. There always is, and certain companies. For example, Fleischmann Hillard has a subsidiary called GMMB, which does all of the Democratic Party's media buying. So that every 2 years, right, in the midterms and in the main election, they get a revenue bump, and there are others around that. You have to be prepared. Every organization has to be prepared for the new administration, whichever side it is, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats. They need to be working out how they're going to engage with the new administration. and what are going to be the priorities, and how they're going to react to whoever wins. So it will be, and people seem a little bit more, you just get a vibe that people are a little bit happier.
Yeah.
But it's still, clients are still keeping their checkbooks, pocketbooks fairly closed.
Yeah, it's still a fairly cautious outlook. And what about talent in the PR industry? Because over here, we've very much noticed that the great resignation that we saw after COVID, when talent left the industry and became scarcer to find, has definitely ended now. Indeed, if anything, agencies have been cutting back on staff over the past year or two rather than struggling to find them. Although I would say that fears of a great redundancy replacing the great resignation thankfully doesn't appear to have occurred. Is that the same? Are you finding is there a dearth now of mid-ranking talent in the US?
Well, the employer's back in charge, I think. So our salary survey showed that people are staying in jobs longer. There aren't as many new jobs out there. So the power dynamic has shifted, during the Great Resignation. And this was one of the things that the tech cuts pointed up, that all of these companies, and to be honest, they looked at Elon Musk and they looked at X, and he did it in a pretty egregious manner in the way he cut his workforce. But a lot of the other big tech firms were like, hang on, he's got rid of all these people. And okay, there were big problems with his company, but it didn't fall apart. So they tended to have hired up, staffed up, and they had a correction last year where they were making job cuts. And you could see that through the tech business. And now you're seeing it through other industries. Financial, Citibank got rid of 20,000 staffers, and Walmart made some cuts as well. So the power dynamic is a little bit back in the employer's direction. But I think people did, and especially women in the industry, which makes up sort of 70% of the US workforce in PR, kind of reassess their lives after COVID. And you see that across many different aspects of life, not just the PR industry. But they were maybe thinking, do I want to be working 14, 15-hour days every day, 6, 7 working weekends? People it was such a strange period. We forget, don't we?
Yeah, there has been a big reassessment.
Yeah, everybody changed. So I think there's been people maybe giving up earlier, retiring earlier, or maybe doing more freelance roles or contract roles. But in general, there's the whole return to work thing as well. I think.
I was going to ask about that because I would say in the UK, we moved from 2 days a week to 3 days a week, and now quite a few PR agencies are putting pressure on their staff to come in 4 days a week, some even 5. Is that the same in the States?
It isn't, and it does vary from city to city. So New York, Chicago, San Francisco, the big markets they're not coming back in. It's 2 days a week. Is that the norm.
Is that standard?
2 to 3. That's just pushing towards 3 now in 2024. Ourselves at Haymarket, we're in 2 days a week. So we come in on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. We all come in on the same day so we can work together in a team environment. So it's a sort of mandatory hybrid.
And would the agencies like the staff to come in more than 2 days a week?
I think the clients would.
The clients would.
More to the point, actually, because most of them, a lot of them, were working all through COVID. They were going into an office space, and you forget that there's a massive part of the workforce that didn't have the luxury of not going into a physical location for work, right? Yeah. If you're in a factory or you're
retail,
agriculture, retail, services, transport. And then you've got companies where they've got both, right? So if you're a Walmart, you've got all the retail workers and then you've got all the office workers, and there can be a bit of tension between the two. I think most of the senior people would like to see their people in more than 2 days a week, but it is a constant battle to encourage them back. And you've got to make that time valuable, and you've got to really come up with innovative ways to encourage people. There's no point in sitting there on Zoom calls or with headphones in an office. It's kind of a waste of time. So make sure that people are trying to come up with interesting ways to make sure they make that time beneficial and teamwork building.
And what's happening to salaries? Because obviously we have had a time of high inflation. Do PR firms need to pay their staff increasingly as a result of that? And can PR agencies get that back in increased fees from clients, or is there a bit of a pinch point there?
It's an interesting time for that because I think we'll talk about AI because that plays into that discussion. But again, you forget how big the States is. So there are lots of different markets. So our salary survey actually shows that the most expensive places are DC, head centre of government, and the West Coast, San Francisco. New York actually is probably only third, but still, it's an expensive place, a very expensive place to live. And then you've got more regional markets like Boston and Chicago and Minneapolis, Atlanta, Miami, LA, a big entertainment town, Seattle, Portland. But I think the salaries, you've got to pay a lot in DC to get good people. There's still a gender gap in salaries, which our salary survey showed as well. That is closing, but it's stubborn. It really is stubborn, and it's not closing as fast as it should.
Do agencies have to report on that publicly?
They don't have to. That's one of the reasons we do our survey. So same with diversity. In our agency report, we do get diversity stats, but one holding company, Omnicom, declines to give a stat per industry. They will only give a stat for the whole staff. They don't break it out by PR, media, creative, whereas all the others do, apart from WPP's Ogilvy. So we do get some good stats there, and that actually was a bit disappointing. It showed that after the George Floyd's murder and all the investments and steps forward made, that actually last year when it got a bit tougher financially, the diversity stats went down a little bit.
Okay, so salaries are still going up, and are clients prepared to pay more fees so agencies can pay their staff more?
I don't think that's top of their agenda.
No.
And Kim Sample at the council made the point that if clients are expecting the AI revolution to suddenly result in lower fees, they need, and Kim would say this because she's the trade body for the agencies, think about how much training is going to be needed. Everyone in your agency is going to need to be trained up in AI. And the clients aren't going to pay for that, right? The clients want you to come in ready to advise them. And actually, in some cases, that's a growth area because they want their AI strategy handled by their agency partners. So the days of AI reducing fees for clients is probably 2, 3, 4 years away, because you've got to get that base level of skills up.
But there is an expectation they will reduce fees.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's going to change much more than PR. It's going to change our business. It's going to change everything.
And how does that work? It's just that you can simply automate a lot of things that PR agencies were doing.
Yeah. So you automate the simpler tasks, and the theory is you then have more time to devote to more strategic advice and more in-depth work. But then that does sort of beg the question, well, okay, well, if you're starting out in the industry, I think you started out in the PR industry, were you doing cuttings books and stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm that old.
Everyone has that story, right? You're not doing work like that anymore, but even the more basic level work and writing releases and things like that is going to be supplemented at least by AI.
But of course, you can't automate media relations, which has always been right at the core of public relations. So how does AI help in that sense?
Well, there are many fewer journalists than there used to be. Okay, so there's now 4 or 6 PR people to every journalist? I think it's 4. And journalists have much wider beats. They have to cover a lot more areas and they have a lot less time. So yes, relationships are key, absolutely key, especially senior relationships, that you can maybe get your CEO in front of the right people at the Washington Post, at the Wall Street Journal, at the New York Times. But I think the junior level folks doing more on email and that stuff
can be automated.
And I'm sure, listen, I'm not down on AI, by the way. I think it could produce a massive amount of innovation, not only in the PR industry, but the journalism industry. I think there will be new products that emerge from it that are really revolutionary. And we almost need to think a bit, flip the discussion and say, okay, well, it's coming, it's here actually. How can we make the most of it and how can we get the best out of it? We've got an AI conference coming up in September where we're going to dig into that across all our brands, across campaign, US and medical marketing and media. So,
yeah, well, I think what's interesting is that, by the way, we just had our PR360 conference and we had several very good sessions on AI and the use of AI in comms in that. But it seems to me from what you're saying, Steve, inevitably there will be fewer PR professionals required in that scenario, that it's not necessarily an increase in the number of PR professionals that exist.
Well, there's a bit of a dichotomy because people want more senior counsel and they want more communications advice. The industry and what the value it adds is respected more than ever. So on that end of it, the CEOs and the C-suites in COVID were like, wow, actually, now I get it. Especially with, like employee engagement, for example. That's a whole big growing area.
Yeah, you can automate a lot of that.
Yeah,
surely.
you can, but it's also, a lot of CEOs did town halls in a much more personal, intimate way, and they found that they actually liked it, and actually it was much better, So some of them have kept those habits on, and, think of labor relations. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of labour relations situations in the US. I'm sure there are in the UK. I see the train strike's still going on, even though I've been away for a year. So that's a big. We had a session on that at the crisis event. So I think that we'll go toward higher value add, more skilled jobs, and that's why. And that actually also means that we've had some interesting startups. People leaving established corporate affairs firms and getting their own thing going. That's been a bit of a story over the last year as well.
So I want to talk a bit about purpose, because I have this theory that 2023 marked the end of peak purpose, a decade where purpose in ESG was the absolute obsession of companies and campaigns. And it seemed to me that kind of came to an end last year. Certainly at Cannes last year, there were about half as many purpose campaigns were entered for the competition. And it seems to me the political polarisation and culture wars make purpose campaigning more risky for organisations to undertake. Are you seeing the same thing in the States?
There was a survey of results, statements and mentions of purpose, and they were definitely down in annual reports as well.
Down year on year.
Yeah, McDonald's almost took the word purpose out of its annual report. But part of it is about certain phrases, like ESG has become a dirty word, even DE&I, which is frankly...
Really? That's become a dirty word.
It's because it's politicised, and certain people think it's
seen as woke.
Yeah, I mean, that word is heard a lot. You heard it in the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Colin Jost made quite a funny joke about woke, in the context of the two candidates being half asleep half the time. But I don't think it's gone away. I think it's just the BP CEO was Alan Murray from Fortune, who runs their CEO product, interviewed him last year, and Bernard Looney, his name was, because he's subsequently left. He basically said, look, we're still doing ESG, we're just not calling it that anymore. We are committed to those things and we'll continue to do them, but we might have to just change the way we describe them or talk around them.
As impacts or something else.
Yeah, I mean, it gets a bit silly sometimes because you're just coming up with another acronym.
Yeah, I get the narrative has changed a bit, but are they spending as much money on communicating and campaigning on these things?
There were a couple of things that happened. The Bud Light situation, which was totally mishandled by Anheuser-Busch from a communications point of view.
Yeah, because they flip-flopped quite a lot on that one.
Yeah, it was a tiny little piece of messaging in one massive campaign and a whole marketing strategy that they should have just presented as that and moved on. But they totally reacted in the wrong way. They made it a 3 or 4 month story when it could have been a 2 or 3 day story.
This is the Dylan Mulvaney.
Dylan Mulvaney, yeah, the influencer, the trans influencer.
And do you think that was a warning for lots of other companies just to rein back on similar campaigns?
I think some of them have done that. But, Molson Coors did a campaign aimed at women who drink, newsflash, women drink beer as well as men, and they just stood by their campaign and said, yeah, this is part of our audience. We do lots of different types of marketing and comms. And this was a campaign and it went away. People did get spooked by that incident. And you see the way the health brand Hims and Hers, the other week we did a story about their CEO talking about, I'd like to hire some of the protesters, right, outside the universities. And what he meant was, I like their spirit and I like their initiative, et cetera, but it got taken the wrong way. And, on the Friday, their share price was down 8%.
Well, they were seen as supporting Hamas or pro-Palestinian by a simple statement like that.
And he had to walk it back over the weekend, which actually meant the share price went down even more. So you have to be really careful about how you do it. Yeah. And that's where you need good in-house and agency advice, right? So that's where you need smart comms, right?
Yeah,
I think
that's advice and judgment rather than big campaigning tools, which could explain some of the trends we've alluded to earlier.
Yeah, and look, it depends on the brand, doesn't it? If you're Ben and Jerry's or Nike, you can do something very different to a Bank of America or GM. You've got permission to do things. Nike with the Colin Kaepernick work, their share price went down initially.
And then it went back up.
Then it went back up and it stayed up. So
because they had that commitment, they had that authenticity, and
authenticity is the word.
Backing those causes. Yeah. Okay, finally then, what about the environmental conversation? Because of course, when it comes to purpose, we've had years and years of clean creatives and Extinction Rebellion and so on, targeting PR companies, and yet most PR professionals, I think, want to fight climate change and create more sustainable businesses. But where's that debate at the moment in the States?
It's interesting being someone who's from Europe and living in the States. It is very different. I think the discussion around climate is far advanced in Europe compared to the States. It's very much been the car, it's part of your identity over there, and
freedom,
filling it up with gas, and getting out on the highway,
almost a human right.
Yeah, and also when we had the Ukraine war and the supply chain issues, people realized how important energy was. And actually, under Biden, the US is now energy independent, ironically, because he gets dinged a lot for being woke in that way. There was a story the other week about some of the oil industry executives meeting Donald Trump and his people down at Mar-a-Lago, and it was kind of presented as, look, this is big energy just dialing back into fossil fuels and going for it. Actually, those discussions happen all the time, right? What I said earlier, you have to be in touch with both parties so that you know what's going to happen after the election, so you can plan in advance. But it got portrayed very much as, oh, look, big oil's back at it. And look, the argument for the Edelmans and other firms is that they are working with big energy to help them with the transition, right? That is the logic, and that's perfectly good logic. But sometimes then they do things that kind of belie that mission.
A bit of deception on the side of some of the PR agencies over time.
Well, yeah,
or certainly not total transparency.
But some of the companies as well. One of the Exxon execs got caught on tape, sort of saying the opposite to what people were saying in public. So it's a big issue. And look, we've all seen the weather, the way it's changed. And I'm not just talking about the roof at Manchester United Football Club.
No, it's a problem that we all need to address, and the PR industry too. Okay, well, thank you, Steve. That's it for this week's show. A big thanks to Steve for joining us today and giving us a more global perspective on this always fascinating comms business. As I mentioned, Steve is around in the UK on Wednesday night's Global Awards, and the winners of PRWeek's Globals will be announced on PRWeek.com on Thursday morning. So please remember to check those out, and good luck to everybody who entered the Global Awards, of course. By the way, the PRWeek UK Awards entry deadlines are now looming, so please do get your entries in now for the UK's PR Oscars, which will take place as usual in October. All the details for these events and many others are on prweek.com/UK, along with all the latest industry news and trends reports. Finally, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then we'd love it if you'd leave a review, please, wherever you access PRWeek's Beyond the Noise podcast. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening, and join us again soon.